Good morning, Pranab. This is the first episode of the new feature that we have launched today called Conversations. I'm Ashok Kotwal, I'm the editor-in-chief of Ideas for India. And I'm going to speak to Professor Pranab Bardhan, who's a professor emeritus at Berkeley. We're going to talk about a topic, left versus right. And I'll explain in a minute what it means, but Pranab has written extensively on various aspects of this topic. Pranab, over my lifetime, entire post-war era, left and right were well-defined terms. And they were kind of cast in Marxian terms that, the left tried for the protection and well-being of the working class, and right worried much more about the entrepreneurs and capital owners where incentives mattered. Now, when India became independent, there's a whole spectrum of political parties, each distinguished, differentiated itself from others on how left they are or how right they are in the Marxian terms. For example, we had the whole spectrum starting, CPM, CPI, various socialist parties, and then Congress sitting somewhere in the middle. And on the extreme right, we had Swatantra Party, which was a libertarian party. But this was not just India. Throughout Europe as well as United States, that was the situation. In Britain, Labour Party represented the interests of the working class, and conservatives or Tories represented the interests of the capital owners and entrepreneurs. US, it was a similar kind of split, Democrats, Republicans, and in fact, all over the world. So when somebody talked in terms of left versus right, we knew that the tensions between political parties were really the tensions between two kinds of economic ideology. And this continued. In fact, all the different struggles that took place, including the Cold War, Vietnam War, even the local struggles, Maggie's war, Maggie Thatcher's wars on miners, or Reagan's attempt to destroy the union movement. They were all exactly split according to these ideological differences. But in the 90s, globalization arrived and it changed the world topsy-turvy. Very, very rapidly, what we saw was the meaning of the left and right change. The things that we had never contemplated started happening. Instead of this struggle between economic ideologies, it was replaced by cultural wars. And culture is again something that people could define themselves. But the resentment toward big bad capitalists from the working class changed to resentment of the educated elite who seemed to run the show. What do you think happened that it changed so suddenly and slightly differently across different countries? But we are now hearing the slow drumbeat of illiberal political movements all over the world. How did this happen?
So that's a very large question. Let me take different aspects of it. Yes, in fact, the term left-right, it started with actually from the French Revolution time. The origin of the term left and right was due to how the members of the French National Assembly after the revolution sat. Usually those who were more for the progressive ones sat on the left, and that's how it started. And you are right that in large parts of the world, it actually, the differentiation was in terms of these economic issues that you mentioned. But let me show you, even long before globalization, I'm going to come to the issue of globalization in a minute. Long before globalization, there were ambiguities, even in this left-right distinction in many countries. United States, the issue of abortion, gun rights, in more recent decades, gay rights, those became issues taken by the right wing, not the left wing. So the part of the right-left distinction in the United States for quite some decades, even before globalization, was on cultural issue. Now let me give you the example of India. If you think about it, the distinction between the left and Gandhians, where was the distinction? Of course, Gandhians tried a different economic strategy compared to the Nehruvians and the left. But there was also some, you might call it cultural, but non-economic issue. And what I have in mind is, how do you look at the state? Usually, the left wants the state to be important. In the early 1990s, I wrote an article on this issue. I openly said that the left-right distinction seems to be less relevant, and the left-right distinction in the usual way. What is more relevant is, how do you look at the state vis-a-vis society? So Gandhians and the left had a different way of looking at state and society. Gandhians emphasized local community and underemphasized the state, whereas the left emphasizes the state. And paradoxically, which is the other group which emphasizes the state? At that time, Jansang, later BJP, they want a strong state. So it's paradoxical that BJP, which Jansang before time of globalization, they would emphasize the state. So the left, far left, the communists want a strong state. And those who don't want a strong state emphasize society, community, etc., where the Gandhians, subaltern historians, environmentalists, though they wanted the local community much stronger. I'll give this as an example that even though historically, and particularly in Europe, the left-right distinction has been mainly on the issue of state versus market, actually. Those who emphasize market were called right. Those who emphasize state were called the left. But I'm saying that the United States and India, these other distinctions were important, where non-economic issues were important, and where how you look at the state vis-a-vis the local community were important. So in that sense, already before globalization, there is this complexity. And then after globalization, as you rightly pointed out, because of the China shock in the United States and also somewhat in Europe, the workers started going against the Democrats. There also, I would emphasize this issue that you brought up, question of liberal elite. I think it has to do with one important economic issue. Over time, when we talk about the distinction or the contradictions between capital and labor, capital is not the same capital as 50 years back. The nature of capital has changed. Capital is not just physical capital. Over time, even before globalization, another type of capital became increasingly important, what economists call human capital. And human capital is partly about education. So as the educated professionals became more important, they are also capitalists of a sort. They are more in the business of human capital. So if you call them human capitalists, over time became more important as technology progressed, their human capital became very important. So, and the other aspect of is those who have education, those who have human capital, they can adapt much more easily than blue collar workers. Blue collar workers is very difficult to change jobs or skills, whereas education, and that's one of the major advantages of education, gives you more adaptability. That's where the globalization came. And it's not just globalization. The other reason working classes lost jobs in the rich countries, automation. So the educated became much more cosmopolitan because that professional job they could get anywhere. Well, not anywhere, but they're much easier to get. So they became much more pro-globalization over time. For these two reasons, their adaptability is more to globalization. And secondly, human capital became much more important in the production process for both reasons.
And I may add one more thing, is that the educated elite had tenured jobs, so to speak, right? They had jobs were stable. They were not constantly afraid of losing their jobs. And that sort of changes your perspective between now and tomorrow, right? So their priorities became oriented much more toward long term, right? Like climate change. Whereas for the workers, especially in the US, they work on fossil fuel industry. Again, there, they feel their jobs are threatened and the elite are actually taking the policies way beyond their horizons, and they resented that.
I understand the point you're making, but the only difference I'll have, when you said that the educated sector, educated people have tenured jobs, that's probably true, Ashok, between you and me, because we work for public enterprises. But in the private
so relatively stable jobs, I think.
Yes, even the professionals changing jobs all the time. For example, in the United States, even your pensions are not are secure. So I would say it is not, yes, I agree that there is some bit of that your jobs are much more stable. But I think it is more the adaptability issue that I mentioned. Even in the private sector, you lose your job. If you're educated, it's easier for you to get a job. So the adaptability issue that I'm talking about, the job stability issue that you are bringing, I would regard them as part of the same general scheme of things. They had a different attitude. But if I distinguish between adaptability and stability, then the issue that you are bringing up as how do you look at the long term will differ a little bit in the sense that it's much more cultural. Education by itself adds a cultural value to your mind. You become interested in other issues, and cosmopolitan issues. Climate change is a cosmopolitan issue. I'll give you a counterexample where even the poor people become interested in the environment through religion. Some religious groups think God's earth needs to be protected.
Pranab, some of the recent trends where people turn against the educated elite, fine. They also turn against the very sense of what the elite are pursuing. For example, science. Why are these populist right-wing groups turning against vaccines and basically rejecting the findings of the research community?
May I go back again that this is not recent? Gandhiji, for example, quite often said things against modern science because he thought science can be destructive, and which is true. There are many aspects of science which have been destructive. In fact, in India, if you follow the Gandhians plus the subaltern historians, and somebody who's a friend of mine who falls in that middle category, in the middle of these two, is this probably India's one of foremost social scientist is Ashish Nandi. He has written several articles against modern science, essentially the destructive aspects of modern science. There was a very famous dispute between Gandhi and Tagore. There was a Bihar earthquake in 1934. Gandhiji said that the earthquake is how God is punishing us for untouchability. And Tagore very furiously opposed that. He said, yeah, I'm against untouchability, but don't say it, earthquake in which so many people died is God's way. So what I'm saying is that kind of an issue has come up in other contexts.
Was there a Gandhi, like this kind of thinking?
Outside India also, there are groups which are environmentalists. They are not completely anti-science, but they think some aspects of science need to be moderated. So I think this is ultimately, I think, a cultural issue.
Pranab,
Yeah.
you have written quite extensively about the differences between what happened in US and Europe. One thing that has stayed in my mind was that we economists always emphasize the gains from trade, but underemphasize that there are winners and losers in the trade game. And the reason the loss of jobs was not a big part of the resentment of European workers was because the compensation there was higher than in the US. The safety net was better. And indeed, the thing that we forgot this, and that large sections of US manufacturing were the losers, and they were not adequately compensated. But in Europe, it was the refugee crisis and the Muslim immigrants and so on. So it started out straight away with resentment of incoming foreigners and so on. Can you say something about these differences across countries?
Yes, in fact, US-Europe distinction clearly shows that the issue of immigration is so important, relatively speaking, not so much the China shock, because China shock was there in Europe as well, but that was less prominent because of the safety net. However, there is also another issue which I have written about related to this, is this. If it were mainly an economic issue of job loss, income loss, etc., then the question one has to answer, why did the workers go to the right? Why not go to the far left? Because far left was anti-globalization, far left was stronger protection of workers.
Yeah.
And if you try to answer that question, culture becomes very important. Far left were not providing an answer because far left also support immigration. Far left want abortion rights, gay rights, and all that. So the workers deviated from the far left on those cultural issues. And in the specific United States case, gun rights. However, immigration is not just a cultural issue. Immigration, obviously, is an economic issue. And that's related to the job insecurity issue that you mentioned before. And again, the economic aspect of the job issue in Europe was less prominent because of the safety net. There, they were mostly saying that these immigrants are coming and becoming a strain on the welfare state. And let me give you the example from, so there are some studies of the analysis in the 2020 presidential election in the United States. They find majority of less educated white working classes voted for Trump. They now find a significant, not majority, a significant proportion of Hispanics and a significant proportion of Blacks voted for Trump. And if you try to understand why, then you see cultural issue trumps the economic issue there. So, and there is a divide
No,
there.
but why do you say that? Because the blacks and Hispanics were also affected by job losses and through the.
Yes,
I mean, people
yes,
who voted twice for Obama voted for Trump.
because they were divided. So if you ask the Hispanic voter or the black voter, do you want minimum wages, which the Democrats were in favor of? Most of them will say yes. But are you in favor of abortion rights? Are you in favor of gay rights, etc.? They're socially conservative. Economic issues, quite often they were with the Democrats, but on the cultural issue, they're the Republicans. And that's why the majority of blacks and Hispanics voted for the Democrats, but a significant fraction voted for Trump. Now, if I may now go back to India, what I originally said, that this distinction between left and right, if you look at Johnson or RSS before the origin of these right-wing parties, RSS is mainly a cultural organization. What is the RSS economic policy? It's economic nationalism. What does economic nationalism mean? Protection, everything, what now Indian leaders are talking about, Atmanirbhar, that's an RSS economic nationalism issue. Now, if you ask me which other party is economically nationalistic in that sense, for protection, import substituting industrialization, is the far left in India. Quite often, many of the communists want protection, anti-globalization. So there, it's not the right-left in the traditional sense. You see both the RSS and some of the communists are equally economically nationalistic in that sense. So it becomes much more complex that way.
That's true. I mean, India itself was not really affected by globalization at all.
Well, I would say India has been affected by globalization. So the products that the poor buy are made in China. You probably know that in Mumbai, even the Ganesh idols are made in China. I think, again, this is a generally true, just in India. In fact, recently I saw a survey on attitude to globalization. A large number of countries, developing countries are pro-globalization by and large.
Yeah.
And developed countries, rich countries, not all, but some, particularly the most pro-globalization country is Nigeria, one of the poorest countries. And one of the most anti-globalization is France. Attitude to globalization is not a major distinction in developing countries and particularly in India, but there is again this peculiar convergence between right and far left. Far left is anti-globalization and RSS is anti-globalization in that sense. And I think one is to distinguish between the economic and cultural issue. But RSS is primarily a cultural organ. They want a Hindu Rashtra. In India, the right wing now is more identified with this cultural issue of Hindu majoritarianism. And this has been the case in some other countries. In Turkey, it's Muslim majoritarianism. So Erdogan is their leader. To some extent in Brazil, Bolsonaro gets the vote of the white evangelicals, Christian evangelicals, and so on. But I think religious majoritarianism is the major division between right and left in countries like India.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that with this shift to the cultural nationalism, somehow there is a hankering for a strong man, some autocrat who would set things right, kind of loss of faith in democratic structures. So how did everything that we have been saying crystallized into that?
Let me see, different people mean different things by populism. Most economists essentially mean populists are those who are short-termism. Those who don't look at the long run interests go for popular short-term gimmicks. But if you read the political science literature on populism, most of them would say populism, in that sense, is illiberal. Populism wants to get rid of these liberal processes which delay things. A leader like Trump or Orban in Hungary, or Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, these leaders tell them, I will deliver you the goods, but I don't want these liberal processes, or what is called due process, which takes a lot of time. And that is consistent with the majoritarianism, because majoritarians don't like the minority rights. One of the reasons why they're so angry with the liberals is because the liberals, they would say, would appease the minorities. Left liberals in India would appease the Muslims. Left liberals in Turkey would appease the Kurds. Left liberals in Europe would appease the immigrant Muslims. President Macron in France, his party is now using a term called Islamo-left, left which likes the Islamic people. So going back to your populism, it becomes essentially kind of majoritarianism trampling upon minority rights. And in a sense, this is a major liberal value. And that's where I have myself in my writings distinguished between two kinds of nationalism. The nationalism that Indian leaders and leaders in Turkey, Trump, Orban in Hungary, Putin in Russia have is what I would call ethno-nationalism. Nationalism based on some ethnic group, ethnic pride. The other kind of nationalism is what I call, or some other people have called, civic nationalism, in which nationalism is based on some constitutional liberal values. If you take the two largest democracies, these started with civic nationalism. The nationalism of Gandhi, Tagore, Nehru, Ambedkar.
I think that this latter nationalism is akin to what we experience during sports events, right?
Oh,
when
yes.
India is playing cricket with England, and a lot of us get very tense and we want our team to win, whether
Right.
it's Olympics.
In Europe, it takes the form of soccer. But when does it combine with ethnic nationalism? In football, for example, many of the European teams now, if you look at the skin color of the players, half of them are blacks. And so the ethnic nationalism is having a problem with that football nationalism.
All the factors you mentioned leading to this kind of right-wing populism existed, right, in the post-war era, almost 1990 or so. Now, what change did the advent of social media had a major impact on this kind of thing becoming possible?
I would emphasize there are several factors. Let me emphasize right now two things that I have not talked about so far. One is just now what you mentioned, social media. Of course, social media can be a good vehicle for left-wing ideas as well. But now increasingly data are showing that the more false something that you put in the social media, something you start, some idea or rumor or what have you, the more outrageous it is, it spreads faster. Bad ideas spread faster, and this is now documented. There are now examples. The conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories spread like wildfire in social media. And there are psychologists are now writing about this. Why is it that the right wing can use the social media much more than the left wing? It's because of this human psychology or mob psychology of bad ideas, conspiracies, rumors, etc. More outrageous things spread much faster, and that gave the right wing an advantage.
This kind of device that people use to kind of centralize power, anybody who loves your party's ideas, your ideas, a mob that invaded US Congress, Trump called them patriots. And same thing is going on in all these right-wing groups. Where does that come from, patriot?
Because it's going back to the ethnic nationalism. These patriots were invading the US Congress. They were all fanatic supporters of Trump. So what did Trump stand for them? Make America great. And the same thing in India. The guy who is lynching Muslims, he thinks he's a patriotic because these are traitors. Something else happened in this recent period. To me, it's extremely important. The decline of trade unions. All over the world, trade unions have gone down. The decline of trade union itself is an endogenous variable. But for the time being, if I regard it as an exogenous, take it as an exogenous variable, decline of trade union institutions or labor organizations is very important in this cultural economic distinction that we have discussed earlier. The blue-collar workers had a sense of belonging to a shared institution. And the trade union was not just a wage bargaining. Trade union was also a cultural, social institution for the workers. I have personally known workers in Europe who regarded the trade union as a kind of local club where you go for cultural activities. But with the decline of trade unions, there has been a cultural void. That's where the populist right-wing cultural issues fill that cultural void. The left needs to fill in that cultural void. And with talking about left instead, I find in United States, but a little bit less in Europe, is more going in the identity issues like Black Lives Matter. Those are important. But if you overemphasize it, that gives the right a handle because you are not filling the void that the blue-collar workers are facing.
Is this why people are started talking about community, the role of community?
That's where the left-right distinction is somewhat vague. I gave you the example of Gandhiji. Gandhiji openly says in Hind Swaraj that I'm an anarchist. He doesn't believe in the state. And this is where the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate was about. Ambedkar, for understandable reasons, said community, the village community is a cesspool of caste discrimination, oppression. So local community has this problem. I'm glad that Raghu Rajan has come out with a book called The Third Pillar. And the third pillar is community. I have written on decentralization. And decentralization is about taking some of the power from the state and bringing it to the local community because local community have more information, coordination problems sometimes are easier, etc. So there are many things, including environmental, by the way, irrigation water, grazing land, forestry. These are local environmental issues which is difficult to solve by the centralized state. For example, America, who is in favor of state rights? The right wing. They don't want the federal government. They want state rights so they can go on oppressing the blacks. And the same oppression of Dalits in India. Khap panchayats in Haryana get all the power. It is power in the community. And just remember just then think what will happen to the Dalits. So I think it's a community to me is a complex issue. I want decentralization. At the same time, I want some checks on that community power.
I think people operate at two levels. They look for what regime would be good for them and their families, individual. But also the appeal of patriotism, doing something for a higher collective, a nation, is huge. I mean, it's surprising how many millions of young people are willing to go to war, right? When it's their life, and it is this appeal of doing collective good. And the first kind of nationalism that you mentioned is very good at harnessing. A lot of dictators have risen to power on that basis. So
Sure.
what?
There is no reason why you cannot inspire people nationalistically, but through the civic nationalism. Let me give you an example from the United States, which is in some sense, they started with civic nationalism with the Constitution. Think of the American Civil War, the middle of the 19th century. Now, Abraham Lincoln, who was fighting the pro-slavery South, if you remember, his speeches were invoking civic nationalism. Gettysburg Address starts with saying, a nation that is born in liberty, or something like that. So what is he saying? We are a nation and not born of ethnicity. We are a nation born on some values of which liberty is very important for us. And that's, he was bringing it up to fight against slavery or interests of slavery. So it is possible. He won that war and he obviously mobilized a large army. I know it's more difficult because things like Hindu nationalism or things like Christian nationalism sometimes appeals to your emotions. But there, the reason why social movements are important is to say Hinduism is not just about anti-Muslim. Hinduism has a lot of other values. Large part of Hinduism preach tolerance. So you can even organize Hindus as Hindus, but not necessarily as anti-Muslim.
Okay, with that, I think we should bring our conversation to an end. It was very nice talking to you. We covered a lot of space. And I think you have unusual insight to deliver on each aspect of this. And I congratulate you for that. Thank you so much, Pranab.
Thank you, Ashok, for inviting me.